I've got one question for the ranking member. Ranking Member Waters, in a 2008 hearing, you said, quote, "And guess what this liberal will be all about? This liberal will be all about socializing, would be about basically taking over the government and the government running all of your companies," end quote. Simple question, do you stand by that statement?
Simple answer. I am here today in this Rules Committee because we're taking up time with basically a non-issue. First of all, you claim that socialism has engulfed this country, that it keeps creeping, it's going to take over private businesses, et cetera, et cetera. That is not happening. We're in a democracy that we're trying very much to save and to not have disrupted, undermined in the way that...
So then, reclaiming my time, the gentlelady denounces your previous statement then, and do not accept that previous statement that you think you would take over these private businesses?
I'm not a socialist. I'm a capitalist. And I commit to you that I am here to save Social Security, to save Medicare, to save seniors and veterans. And for some of you who have adopted certain kind of ways that you support what you now claim is socialism, I'm here to say to you, come on.
So this liberal will be all about socializing, will be all about basically taking over and the government running all of your companies. You disagree with that? You now denounce that statement?
I am not a socialist.
Okay.
All right?
So I appreciate the response. I think that to the extent that one has a concern as a member of this body or as an American watching this, one has concerns when we hear statements like this, and that's not the only one. And statements by some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle extolling the virtues of socialism, as I just pointed out. A nicer way of confiscating businesses, a nicer way of confiscating the assets and the means of production. When now, as I think the gentleman from Kentucky was alluding to, in 1929, federal spending was 3% of GDP. At the height of COVID, 31% of GDP. In FY22, we collected a record $4.9 trillion in revenue, but still had a $1.4 trillion deficit. I think one question I would ask the chairman of Financial Services is, do you have full control over the means of production if you're a company in this country, but yet the government is regulating you so much that you cannot actually carry out the use of the capital for the purpose for which you have the company created? In other words, for example, ESG requirements. For example, maybe it's some of the USDA regulations requirements that prohibit small businesses from being able to crack into the monopolies that the gentlelady from New Mexico is referring to with respect to meat processing in this country. There are heavy USD regulations prohibiting that, as the gentleman from Kentucky has talked to, and I'm happy to yield to him in a minute if he would like. We could go and sit here for the next 5 days without adjourning. No, don't worry, Mr. Chairman, I won't do that. And go through a list of regulations that are impacting businesses in this country. So my question for the chairman is, do you have the full control over the means of production as a private citizen, business owner in our capitalistic system, if the government regulation is preventing you from being able to deploy that capital in the best means possible to carry out your business?
No. And this is what we're trying to address. We have seen major pieces of legislation to rewrite our economy come through Congress, and have failed. And then we see different actions that go through the regulatory state, independent agencies to write regulations, to achieve those outcomes through regulation. There is a move to make our banking system the arbiter of how you allocate capital to produce energy. There are various proposals in government agencies around achieving social goals. Social goals that they then put in place into business regulation that then controls the business outcome and their ability to actually get a return for the investors that own those businesses. So what we see here is the same intention of wholesale rewriting the economy, but through the independent agencies in the regulatory state. And so we'll bring legislation through the committee later in the Congress to address those challenges. And I think we can have a fulsome debate about whether or not that is actually achieving a better economic outcome or the stated objectives of those policies. But we need to get into those debates about climate and ESG, and we'll have formulated policy here to address those concerns.
I appreciate the chairman. I will.
Will the gentleman yield?
Well, I was directed, but if the gentlelady would like to speak, I'm not going to ask her not to.
Thank you. A lot of what we do in financial services have to do with regulations. A lot of what is attempted on my side of the aisle is to protect investors and protect people who take a chance, for example, on Wall Street investments, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's interesting to point out that for years, Wall Street preyed upon communities of color, offering predatory loans. Other banks then tried to swindle pension plans, and ultimately, there was nothing else to steal, and it all fell apart. It was this body that stepped in to rescue Americans. I'm proud of our efforts to rebuild our economy, to allow lawful businesses to prosper and Americans to succeed. So what I think is important is this. You allude to, and many Republicans allude to, businesses without credible regulation. Do whatever you want to do. Do it in whatever way you want to do it. On my side of the aisle, yes, I lead the arguments from time to time about how we have to have SEC as a cop on the block, about how we have to have the Consumer Financial Protection Agency in order to protect people who would be taken advantage of. And I think that if you're thinking about socialism as a government that should not be doing these things, that should not be stepping in to protect the average American, then I'm certainly not with that. And I don't think most Americans are with that. We are about those who want to be in business, to have the opportunity to invest their money, to save their money, to put it into businesses. But we're not about you can do anything that you want to do. You can steal, you can undermine, you can do whatever it is to increase that
okay,
profit.
and if we can and
Yes.
explore, I was going to yield back, but I'm going to explore that for one more second, which is to say, you know, what the gentlelady just describes, I've not heard any member of this side of the aisle say that they think that there should be a unfettered, unbridled environment in which there aren't certain rules of the road, right? I mean, either at the end of the day, you either have corporations who can grind over the American people. I would suggest to you a great example of that is Pfizer and Moderna making $100 billion on the back of the environment right now today where there are government mandates with pharmaceutical companies with liability protections making hundreds of billions of dollars without any liability constraint. So now those corporations can grind out right over the American people with no chance to go to court to get regress for their grievances and no chance to get any real significant government help on the side of that for this whole debate about regulations or being able to go to court, right? Those are your options. Either the capitalistic system grinds over you or you get to go to court to go sue to protect your well-being, or you're going to have some sort of government regulation to provide some guardrails. And the fact here is we're doing exactly the wrong thing right now with government, corporate cronyism, and collusion with major pharmaceutical companies that are grinding right over the American people's ability to be able to take care of themselves. So I think that's actually a really important point. And the last point that I'd make was the gentleman from Colorado, unfortunately he's not here, so I hate to refer to him in the third person, he's not here, but had talked about that the first thing that was done was at last last year was the, what was the act? What's the thing called? Oh, the American Rescue Plan. It's hard to remember these fancy titles. Didn't rescue anything. The fact is, what we ended up with is now 1 in 4 U.S. parents are saying they've struggled to afford food or housing in the past year, an incredibly low labor force participation rate, inflation we haven't seen for 40 years, in significant part because the government acted and engaged yet again and interfered with the ability of the American people to drive their success. And that is at the heart of the actual cultural debate we're having right now about government versus who owns the actual means of production in the private sector. I'll yield to the gentleman from Kentucky.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding. I think we probably ought to have a resolution that might get 430 votes, which would be to denounce cronyism, because we seem to be in agreement with that. Ms. Fernandez has had a great point about the monopoly that the meat packers enjoy. And we're working together on that because there is a monopoly, and no monopoly can long survive in a true free market. It's the government, we give carve-outs, handouts, scale prejudicial regulations that hurt the little guys, indemnifications, which you mentioned. If we could get rid of some of those special favors that we're doing up here and get closer to true capitalism, which I think the other side of the aisle is not averse to, actually, or at least the ones here in the Rules Committee. I think this resolution presents a tougher problem for some of the other people on the floor as opposed to those of you here in the Rules Committee. But let's work together on a resolution. I'll yield back at some point to try and get 430 plus votes on basically denouncing cronyism. I'd love. I
appreciate the gentleman from Kentucky. I agree. I do think there's some common ground that we should seek on that sort of thing. I know, as you talk about the Prime Act, the gentlelady from New Mexico, I certainly support that legislation. I think that gets to the heart of what we're talking about. Free up capital, free up the American entrepreneur, free up people in their laboratories of democracy in the 50 states without having centralized, oppressive regulation coming from Washington, whether it's through the USDA, whether it's through, financial regulation, whatever it might be. Let's free the American people up to get us out of this. We want 4 and 5 and 6% economic growth. You're not going to get out of $32 trillion of debt unless you get back to 4, 5, 6% economic growth. And we can do that if we trust the American people instead of government to answer those questions. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. If I'm correct, right, was it in March, what year is this, 24? In March of 22, like 2 years ago, President Biden signed an executive order, right, exploring the pros, cons, benefits, the path forward or whatever on such a concept, right? So it's not without concern that this is something that's right in front of us as a nation, right? I would assume this is should be one of the less partisan things that we should be putting forward. That regardless of one's ideology or political bent, that the concept of any government being able to insert itself into the currency that is being used to carry out free enterprise between an American citizen and another American citizen engaging in commerce, and therefore then use the power of government to influence the choices in commerce beyond what we already do with respect to tax policy, with respect to other levers of governmental power, that is the genesis behind what we're trying to do here with prohibition. Mr. Hill, would you be able to expand on that a little bit? I know you said so in your opening statement, but I think it's really critical for people to understand. People always get, they always try to kind of mock or laugh at the slippery slope arguments, and I've yet to see a slippery slope argument made over the last 20 years that hasn't roughly been correct for the most part. And so I would just suggest that if we go down the road of CDBC, that this government would be able to insert itself into policy choices on right and left, right? This money cannot be used for an abortion. This money cannot be used for a purchase of a gun. This money can be used only for charging a car versus buying gas, or this money can be used. Pick your ideological spectrum. It's happened in real time in other governments around the country, notably in China. I just wonder, again, if the gentleman from Arkansas would expand on that a little bit, because I think it's central to some of the concerns Americans have.
I thank the gentleman from Texas, and I I don't share his affection for A&M baseball and the defeat of the Razorbacks over the weekend.
Two out of three? It is.
But I do share his concern over this particular notion, and I think that I make the following points. One, the ambiguity that somehow a central bank in our government could issue what we think is a retail central bank digital currency, which is where our citizens, our businesses would have accounts at the Fed and transact activity in the central bank digital currency, that could be done without a strict authorization oversight by Congress. That's point one where I agree with you. I think there's bipartisan opposition to that. And we've had bills on the floor. In fact, I've co-sponsored a bill with the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Auchincloss, in opposition to it, because under Article 1, it's quite clear that we are responsible for the money coinage and that we've delegated that to the Treasury, and the Treasury has got the Federal Reserve in a distribution fiscal agent status. Number two, I think people should be concerned about the potential of abuse in a situation like that for their privacy and their transactions. And why would they feel that way? I think because of the pattern and practice that they've seen over just the time I've served in Congress. Operation Choke Point, just to name one. So I think we want to make sure that we err on caution by prohibiting this and by saying again, reiterating, it can't be done without authorization of the Congress. Third and final point. In my judgment, the current chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Jay Powell, agrees with that. But guess what? The comments have been ambiguous at the Fed and in the administration. And so I think it's important that Article 1, branch of the government, speak clearly here, and that's why I'm in favor of this bill, and I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will in 1 second if I can follow up and then open it up to the gentlelady. Unlike current dollars in circulation, now obviously we use credit cards, obviously we use Venmo, and let me just say that on Venmo, right? Are there not current efforts by the IRS to say transactions over a certain dollar amount, like $600, and Venmo should have greater scrutiny and greater, reporting and potential regulation? Is that not something that is happening in real time? And then I'll add to that, you can answer that, unlike currency, to the extent we still use currency, that this has a digital tether, right? I mean, there is a connection, a connectivity in terms of what you're talking about in the currency. So putting aside the extent to which we've gone, heavily digital with respect to credit cards, you've got a one-to-one relationship with your credit card company and the systems in place, which of course are regulated. Here, when you go straight up to a currency with that kind of a tether, that there is really, to a significant extent, no real limit other than us on what the government can then do with that, whether it's freezing or seizing assets, with respect to, as I was mentioning before, programming spending. And, I might just say, like, when we talk about these items, you brought up Operation Choke Point. I would also say we saw a lot of these questions, again, without raising the issues of debates that unfortunately got somewhat partisan, but I think we had some agreement and disagreement during COVID. Well, the extent to which government power was being used to then effectuate what citizens could or could not do, would not such a currency give significant and greater power for the government to do that, regardless of the merits? Whatever one thinks about masks and vaccines, mandates, whether you can leave 6 feet circles, whatever the hell you want to go down the line of talking about COVID, wouldn't such a mechanism provide a significant amount more power to the government to be able to effectuate the policies that were trying to be carried out during COVID? But the gentleman expand on those couple of questions, and then I'll turn it to the gentlelady.
Implemented at a retail level with direct accounts, it absolutely would. And I think people have a right, as I said, to be concerned about their privacy. That would be the ultimately non-private activity. And I'll give you one other more contemporary example rather than Choke Point, and that's a debate we've had in the House Financial Services Committee for several Congresses, but intensely last week when we supported a bill by Barry Loudermilk of Georgia on something called the Consolidated Audit Trail that collects everybody's stock trades every day in every brokerage account and are not protecting PII, the personal information associated with that. and that would allow someone to mix that with open source data and triangulate in another database for a hack that makes TikTok look benign. And so this risk is on the top of minds, I think, of the American people. And that's, again, why I think implemented as you describe it, yes, it should be of serious concern to our families for their privacy rights. And I think they have had examples recently, in our recent past, that would indicate the government's a terrible privacy protector. I'll yield back to the gentleman.
The gentlelady had wanted to make a comment.
Yes, thank you so very much. Currently, the Federal Reserve is engaged in a pilot project that looks at how distributed ledger technology can be used to improve efficiency of cross-border payments and settlements involving multiple currency. This is occurring in coordination with other G7 countries, which are also engaged in similar projects to speed up and lower the cost of doing business around the world. Furthermore, all G20 countries are doing the same. In making the United States the only country on the planet to ban a CBDC is just unthinkable. But let me repeat that the only country to prohibit a CBDC would be what Representative Emmer's isolationist bill would do in stopping this testing in its tracks. It would undercut America's commitment to its allies and seriously impair our ability to influence the standards adopted by other nations as we forge ahead with CBDC. All I'm saying is this, if I may, and that is, we don't want to be seen as a country that's not futuristic enough to at least look at it, to explore it, to test, to find out. Right now, we're the only country that is proposing, any of our members proposing a ban. All I'm saying is, let's not stop what the Fed is doing in trying to do the research.
So look, I appreciate the exchange with the gentlelady.
Yes.
I would make two comments. One, the idea that America being alone in choosing a path is probably, in my mind, a indication that that path might be a good one. That's just a personal observation about the tendencies of our of other countries around the world. And I kind of like it when America's thinking independently and trying to think about figuring out how we're going to preserve liberty and make sure that we don't have government control of currency. And I would note, and I say this as a positive, the gentlelady was on the floor when we were having a significant amount of debate and a hotly contested vote that I think I might have disagreed with some of my Republican colleagues on the panel about warrants as it related to FISA. And I would note a overall philosophy for me that I shared. The gentlelady made a comment on the floor saying, you said I'm old enough to remember, respectfully, I'm quoting you, old enough to remember J. Edgar Hoover. And you made the point on the floor about the extent to which the empowerment of government is concerning. And I would just note in this instance, where I might have some disagreements with my colleagues on this side of the aisle and the other side of the aisle on that particular vote, you and I were aligned on that vote, I would just posit here for consideration that what we're doing here, what we're attempting to do, is to Congress speak up and say, no, you're not going to do this. You're not going to go empower government to be able to control a currency at the level that we believe can be foisted on the American people this way. And that does not foreclose continued debate, investigation, discussion about where that would go. We have plenty of committee hearings. We can have plenty of consideration. The Fed can research whatever the hell it wants to research, but we could have a debate about this. But my only point is, I believe it is critically important that Congress speak to say that the power of government should not be used to allow government to be inserted between our use of currency and engaging in free enterprise. But with that, in the interest of time, I will yield back to the chairman.